Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to a very interesting episode of Finding Me on the ITV networks. I'm sure that many of you will be stimulated by the discussion that I have today with my very special guest, Dr. Funmi Olonisakin. She is the Program Director for Postgraduate Studies at King's College in London, as well as the Research Associate at the University of Pretoria. And Dr. Funmi specializes in conflict, peace studies and leadership. So with that, I'd like to say welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now we have a very interesting topic, so I'm going to get right into it.
Indeed.
Basically, many people who write about Africa, they usually say Africa is riddled with conflict, Africa is driven by poverty, and Africa is beset by diseases. How would you respond to that?
I would say, for example, if you say all of those, you can probably find far more than anecdotal evidence that confirms those points. But what people fail to say is that in spite of all of this, Africa is thriving because of its people, because of its young people in particular, and a hopeful, talented generation of young people who will take Africa to the next place and eradicate much of these challenges that we're talking about in the long run.
Okay, but
I choose to see Africa in a more positive light. If Africa was riddled, and ridden, with disease, with conflict and all of this, then Africa should not be existing at this point in time. But yet we have a continent of almost 1 billion people, and the more positives around are the talented people and the very innovative things that take place in Africa, which never get mentioned.
Yeah, it's true. It never gets showcased because very often, if you look at how time is apportioned on TV or through even academic discourses, the idea is to keep enforcing particular stereotypes or particular narratives, isn't it? Yeah. So your whole study is focused around changing the narrative.
Absolutely.
When you speak about changing the narrative, what exactly are you saying?
When I talk about changing the narrative, I'm talking about changing the narrative at several levels. All right? There's a global narrative about Africa. There's also a narrative that has been absorbed over time by African people because that's what they pick up in the majority. But there's a narrative that surrounds what we teach, and how we present, our works most of the time. And they all fuse together, and what gets noticed is often a very negative one. But my narrative is essentially one around leadership, that you cannot look at peace and security effectively, deal with peace and security challenges on the continent of Africa, and for that matter in the developing world, without placing the issue of leadership and how we see leadership and how we portray leadership at the heart of it. Perhaps I could give you...
Yes, I was going to say, how do we see leadership, and then what are the changes that are needed?
Globally, if you even look at the places where leadership is taught, of late in the continent of Africa, we now have a variety of leadership centers in different countries doing different things. As you know, at King's College London itself, we have a leadership center, but the largest part of that program is in Nairobi. It's a collaboration between King's College London and University of Nairobi. We deliberately want to change that narrative away from what you see in management schools, or in fact in the way the United Nations and other actors approach leadership, away from this almighty individual, this personality, this iconic character who would change the world, who would solve all the problems of the continent. For far too long we have focused on the hero, the individual in a position of authority. So it's about a person, it's about the position they occupy. At the village level is the chief, often male, who is the leader at all times, okay? At the level of, institutions, and I'll come to institutions in a minute. It is the head of that institution. So you always have these almighty leaders who are expected to solve all the problems in the environment. And actually it cannot be. You can do that for a business organization and say the buck stops with the CEO, all right? But when you're looking at larger society, with all of the challenges, with all of, with all of the different, if you like, ramifications of conflict, of all the things that we've been talking about, and we expect that a single individual or a set of single individuals will have a solution, that is a challenge. So one aspect of that narrative is that we want to move away from an initial focus that as an entry point, it should be an individual at the helm of affairs. That should be the focus of leadership for conflict transformation, for example, or for long-term development. We're moving away from that into what we call a process-based approach to leadership, which is not new. But we're especially moving away from that and trying to draw a narrative that sees leadership before institutions. And that's very controversial.
Leadership before institutions?
Yes,
like
it's a sequencing issue. Globally, at the United Nations, where we all interact with various colleagues there, even at local or national levels, institution building. We see institutions as a solution to African problems. But actually, I'm not denying that. I'm saying we're placing the cart before the horse because even in the literature we assume that if you have good institutions, if you have effective institutions, that will regulate, if you like, administrative and political behavior. And it ought to. And that is what goes on in other places. But in a continent where our state system has been more or less imposed on us, those states did not emerge from African societies, and we've tried to build institutions as though we're layering it. It's like wearing several layers of clothing, and you expect the outer one to be the one that, that's functional. Absolutely. We think that there's something essentially wrong with that narrative, because without good and effective leaders, you cannot build or sustain good and effective institutions. So our entry point is that of leadership, and we think that African societies have talented individuals who are very, very conscious of the challenges in the environment. But to problem solve, you have to look at the situation that confronts you. If Ebola confronts you, one of the challenges of the time that we're dealing with on the continent is Ebola. Sometimes it's a particular conflict situation. Sometimes it's another kind of environmental crisis. Whatever the crisis is, we ought to look for answers to those problems across society. And it's when you see where those who offer the best solutions to the problems emerge as leaders. So therefore, leadership is more of a situational issue.
Okay, but now I have two questions for you. Considering exactly what you've said, but the narrative and the dominant position of viewpoint that has been promoted from Kingdom Come, and I think it's indoctrinated into the mindsets even of many Africans. Firstly, that Africa cannot have good leaders because Africans are not good leaders. Okay, so that's the first perception. And secondly, even if you have a good leader, the external forces from outside, if they do not agree with the particular vision of that leader, because he is going to lift Africa or lift the Africans, and so of course you must remember Africa is the dumping ground for everyone else. Absolutely. It's going to change the status quo. They will not allow that leader to maintain. So how are you going to overcome those two? Okay,
first and foremost, let's deal with the issue that, of course, these are some of the narratives that persist, and they persist gently and sometimes very viciously about leadership in Africa. Where can you find good leaders in Africa? So in a continent of 1 billion people, we have equated, as I said earlier, leadership with 54 or 55, depending on who you're counting, leaders, heads of state who are governing Africa. And therefore we struggle every time to count 2, 3 or 4 that we might, reluctantly count as good leaders. And in fact, what we define as good leadership, which in my books are not really about good or bad leadership, but about effectiveness in leadership, what we count as good leadership is also a little bit warped. And my point, which is why we need to change this narrative, is how can we look at a continent of 1 billion people and make a claim that there are no good leaders on that continent? Of course, there are good leaders all the time. You see them in different facets of life, in different parts of society, which is why Africa is thriving in the ways that it does at the level of society, which we don't give any recognition to. Because whether we like it or not, on a daily basis, communities face challenges that these single leaders are not responding to, but which they respond to on their own. And like it or not, there are times when the ruling elite are carrying on their business and actually what they do is far removed from the rest of society, and yet the rest of society thrives in its own way.
I think Somalia is a good example of that.
Yes, or Somaliland, in particular, which continue to find solutions to its challenges away from something that we call the pillars of the state, as it were. Yeah, and I think this is all the more reason why we need to rethink this narrative of single individuals who we expect to be leaders in all situations. And to close on that particular point, the moment we take a process approach to leadership, what we see is that if we have a challenge in front of us, flood, earthquake, armed conflict, whatever it is, or whether it's human-made or or a natural disaster, those who respond to those situations respond through a process-based approach, through an exchange of influence. Somebody comes up with an idea, the rest of that community or that society figures that idea might solve the problem. And that person asserts their influence through the ideas that they present. And when the society accepts the assertion of influence, leadership has taken place. When that problem is solved, the situation changes. Whatever the outcome is, we have a new situation and a new leader emerges. If you understand my meaning here, that leadership itself is dynamic. When a situation changes, leaders change. And then we have countries on the continent where the same leaders have been in power for a long, long time, as though they are the only ones, the purveyors of solutions, all solutions, and they have the all remedy to society's problems. This is part of the challenge, because the rest of the world sees this singular approach to leadership, this individual approach to leadership, and they often subsume all processes within institutions. And African institutions exist a lot of the time, not in the formal way that the rest of the world expects institutions to exist. We therefore see African societies that are far removed from state institutions and state structures. And this is the heart of the challenge, I think.
Basically what you're really referring to, I think, is the whole concept of Ubuntu, leadership through Ubuntu rather than through an individual person. But we have to go to a break.
Okay.
So when we come back, I want to ask you a little bit more about conflict and how does one then change the narrative on conflict. So we'll see you after the break.
All right, thank you.